Okay, welcome to Flashback, part 2. But online with us we have Kehinde Andrews, who is the Professor of Black Studies at Birmingham City University. His latest book is The New Age of Empire, How Racism and Colonisation Still Ruled the World. This was published in 2021. He also wrote Black to Black. We have both books here. So we've got Back to Black, Retelling Black Radicalism of the 21st Century, and Resisting Racism, Race, Equality, and the Black Supplementary School Movement. We also have Melanie Abrahams, who is a producer, art curator, visiting lecturer, and mentor who has channeled a love of words and books into initiatives. We've also got live in the studio with us today Camille London Mayo, who was awarded a DMU Research Student Scholarship within the Faculty of Health and Life Science at DMU in October 2020. Her research focuses on Black educators who are navigating the dynamics of racism in Leicester schools. So welcome everybody today. Can I get a hi from everybody online as well?
Hi, good evening.
Hi.
Good evening. And
Good evening.
Camille, how are you today?
I'm feeling great, thank you.
Good. So we're going to kick off straight away because one of the things we're talking about today is institutions, and are the institutions still racist, or still institutionally racist, I should say. So I want to open that up first to Kehinde Andrews. If you could really kind of give us your feedback on there and how you're feeling, because I know you're doing a lot of work on that at the moment.
So I mean, the simple answer to the question is yes, the institutions are still racist. And I think really importantly, when we think about institutional racism, the definition that we use, and I've seen used in universities and places like that, is a really bad definition, which one focuses just on, takes an individual institution, be that a school or be that a museum or be that just like one institution, and then basically looks at, is it diverse enough? Do we have enough education within that institution? And doesn't look at the much bigger picture. The definition of institutional racism we should use isn't like the McPherson report watered down version. It's the definition of institutional racism that comes from Stokely Carmichael and Charles Hamilton's book Black Power in the 60s. And when they say institutional racism, they really mean what we think of as structural racism. So racism that is embedded in society, racism that you can't separate out as to just the schools or just the prison or just it really is, the example they give is actually topical for today. The example they give of institutional racism in that book is the fact that Black women are about 4 times more likely to die in childbirth. I mean, that was in 1960, and it's still the same today, right?
I think it's 5 times now.
And when you say institutional racism, that's what they mean, because that's about, one is about the hospitals, right? It is about healthcare, it is about what practitioners are doing, but it's also much bigger. It's about where the Black people live, it's about poverty, it's about wider health inequalities. And so when we say institutional racism, that's what we should be looking at, the broader, the bigger picture. And if we do that, then we'd have to acknowledge that the schools, the hospitals, the museums, everywhere we are, as we're in a racist society, are going to have institutionally racist outcomes. So when you have the sewage report that came out this year, saying that look, you've got all these disparities, but it's not racism. I mean, that's ridiculous. That's like literally the definition of institutional racism. When you look at all the disparities and you see the Black people doing really badly. So it's not got any better. It's actually just as bad as it ever was, I think.
How about you, Melanie? What's your feelings on that?
Well, I'd definitely say institutional racism is still very rampant. For me, it's always, I just find the sort of emphasis on institutions anyway very kind of alarming and potentially problematic, because we're in a society of individuals, of different groupings, of many different cultures, and this sort of preferential treatment towards institutions as opposed to looking at autonomy and agency and what we need to have as citizens in order to be able to live and thrive and be within a society I think is the more kind of important issues. I mean, when I looked up the sort of definitions, I felt I had to kind of refresh myself with the definitions of institutional. It was relating to an institution, which kind of, takes you back to, it takes you to nothing, but sort of is a kind of circular argument. And then when I looked up institution, again, there was this sense of it being a large and an important organisation. And for me, it's not a question of whether it's large for a start, because we now have so many things that happen online and outside of buildings and edifices, which exert a lot of power. But also this aspect as well of important is also suspect in terms of, it's not a question of whether it's important, it's whether is it relevant and resonant to the 21st century? Is it relevant and resonant to people as well? And for me, I think there's a sort of aspect of a lack of values sometimes within the way that we look at institutions. So instead of us kind of looking to see whether institutions actually hold the kind of values that are fit for the 21st century and are kind of fit for society, we often kind of value them for their large status or their size or their kind of historical grandeur, which I think, just doesn't relate to kind of current times. So I just say that, yes, of course, there's a lot of racism, but in some ways we should be subverting that and asking a different set of questions in terms of what do we need as people to be able to live and thrive and get on with each other, but also to tackle the inherent and the rampant inequalities and inequities that are around at the moment.
Really bad, actually. Where are you coming from? What's your stance on that?
I don't know how I follow that.
I know.
I was going to say that I think that in terms of does institutional racism still exist? Yes, it does. But I'm looking at it from the perspective as a black woman growing up in this society, the families that I'm involved in, how racism affects them, how it affects their lives. And the fact of the matter is it affects all parts of their lives. So I do agree to a large extent with what Kehinde said, in the sense that institutional racism takes over every aspect of our lives. And so therefore, when we just focus on particular institutions, it gives the cop-out for those that feel that they're not part of that. And so we need to actually look at what it takes for us to survive, literally survive in this society, with all the obstacles, all the structural processes that exist to hinder us, because they want to maintain the status quo of, whether you want the big W white supremacy or the little w white supremacist thinking, it's whether it's them trying to maintain the status quo for that, and that's where I think we are right now.
Yeah. Interesting points you've all made there. I mean, with that in mind, we had the whole Black Lives Matter marches and everybody was coming out and there was a big outpour and we gained all these allies that were meant to be supporting, and a lot of the institutions put new programs in that they said that they were looking at unconscious bias and, all these new buzzwords that they were bringing out. But has there actually been any change throughout these institutions? Any kind of tangible change? I mean, we can all tick a box. And for me personally, I've seen some small changes in some of the organisations that I work with, but it's not been enough. So how do you feel about that? Who shall I go to first? Should I pick on one of you guys again, or should I go for you? Go
okay,
on, I'll let you give you a last one in there.
Let me jump in. Okay, so do I think there's been change? I think people are more aware. I think they're more aware of, and they are kind of like, they feel, I'm talking about the white majority in this country feel a bit more sensitive about talking about issues of race, are willing to talk about it. Whereas perhaps 5 years ago or 10 years ago, it was under the radar. I think what's happened in the last couple of years is that everybody wants to be correct, in inverted commas. So everybody's going to talk about the importance of unconscious bias or racial literacy, but all of this I think are just smoke screens. They're smoke screens while they carry on doing what they've always done. So in reality, we're still fighting the racism that we were fighting 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. It's the same racism, but it's like the emperor's new clothes. They're just putting a different thing on it. And then by saying that we have lots of different initiatives, think about the impact and the outcome of these initiatives. It will revert back to what it always has, because these things go in cycles, yeah? And you will always find evidence of these initiatives and things like that occur through history. You'll always see them, but the status quo maintains. This time I feel the difference has to come from us as a community. It has to come from us, because if we're waiting for everybody else to sort themselves out and we're watching that, unless we do something ourselves, nothing is really going to change.
But can I just tip in on that? Because there was something that we have been doing in Leicester over here, and I'm, I don't want to kind of call people out or anything, but I think there's still an old guard that when we're talking about cultural issues, there is a kind of an old guard that has been, they're the ones that people from the council, people from, wherever will go to. And they still seem to be using the same tactics that we've used for the past 20 years. I'm a believer that we need to change the way we're doing things, because I don't, can I put this? I was in a meeting where they said for us to be able to move forward, we have to create our own organisation where we support each other, which is kind of what you were saying. Now, for me, I don't want to be a separate part from that larger organisation. I want to be part of that organisation, that big organisation. So say if it's, I'll just say if it was the Arts Council, and the Arts Council is saying, okay, we know that you as a Black community are not getting enough support, and we know we've got to do something about it. But why don't you lot go off on your own and find out what you need and then come back to it? I don't think that's working. I think we need to be part of those bigger organisations. We need to have a foot under that table so we can actually express how we feel.
But they don't want you to be.
I know they don't want, and that's the point. So. That's the point for me. We need to be forcing them to having us in those tables and getting our foot through that door. And that's my thinking. But let me pass it on to you guys anyway. Who wants to go with that one? Kehinde, I see you shaking your head. Why don't you tip in on that?
Well, I think this is part of the issue is when you ask what's changed. I don't think much has changed. So certainly awareness has changed. Certainly there's more conversations about stuff. But has anything meaningful changed? I personally haven't seen it. In universities, I'd just say it definitely does. I think also in some ways things have gone backwards, particularly institutionally. If you think, like, talking about race isn't always a good thing, because you get a backlash on what we've seen in the UK, from the government in particular. There's been a massive backlash. In terms of government and race relations, it is worse today than it was prior to George Floyd. The sewage report, all that sets back this significantly. Everything's come out of that, the government policy around things. Think about the arts. Jeez, this government's like going white supremacy 100% on the arts and not even pretending. So, in lots of ways, he's actually gone backwards. And that's one of the problems with these institutions, is that, you can try and work in the institution, but they're terrible. Like, honestly, they're really bad. And as someone who works in a really white institution, I just say it's you can do some stuff, it's not impossible, but certainly it's really problematic, and that hasn't got any better. I would have thought it might have got a bit better, but there was a moment maybe where there was a bit, even the nice noises have gone away now. Now it's just back to how it was before, I think, unfortunately.
Can I just come in quickly there? That I think what's quite interesting, the new education secretary at a conference recently was talking about the fact that schools need to be more inclusive. We need to get more Black head teachers. We need to have head teachers that reflect the communities that they serve. In all my years of teaching, I've never heard an education secretary say that. Yeah, I'm not saying that he's got anything behind it, but I've never heard it articulated, right, by an education secretary. Now, I thought to myself, maybe that's a little shift. Possibly not, but it's interesting that actually happened. Yeah, and so when we're talking about change, I don't know if it's change, but it's something that happened. They say
but at the same time, it's also the same government that's saying the curriculum doesn't need to be declined.
Absolutely.
You don't need to have change.
Absolutely.
So if it's just diversity, but the things stay the same.
Yeah.
This government's a perfect example. They're very diverse.
Yeah.
But it's terrible.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, I guess that's different. Though you're right. That is different. Same with more diversity, but it's not necessarily progress.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I guess if I can add to that, people say a lot, and it's what they do, isn't it?
Absolutely.
I think, as you said, Camille, that there are a lot of people now wanting to be correct. They're not necessarily wanting to be accurate, because accuracy requires knowledge, and it requires paying attention, and it requires having some care about the subjects and the themes. And I think at the moment, there's often sort of tokenistic kind of references around race and culture, but if we kind of look into it, there are numerous countries within Africa and the Caribbean that many people will not know about, will not know in depth. They might not even know the difference between Africa and the Caribbean, or they might think it's the same thing. So I think around, and then there's also South Asia and all the kind of specificities around that. And what I found is, during my time kind of working as a cultural producer and someone who's trying to kind of foster interest and excitement about diversity and about all the different rich cultures that exist, within our many cultures, I find that people generally kind of skim the surface and they don't kind of get within, and they don't actually know the geographies and the kind of histories and the kind of localities and the vernaculars of things. So I think that if anything, people should try, if they really are interested, and adopt it just as they do with anything else that they might see as lifelong learning or ongoing learning, or a sense of iterating your knowledge and building, upon it layer by layer. It's that kind of thing of Black History Month, not just being a month, but being a kind of evolving way in which you can learn about a deep and a rich, history. And I think that's kind of the issue that we have within society, in terms of things are very kind of temporary, and there's this kind of very tokenistic aspect about learning what are in fact very rich and evolved cultures.
Yeah. I mean, have you got anything to come in on that? I mean, I agree with that, because it does come from knowledge. Knowledge is the key with all of the expressions that we're trying to show the wider public at the moment. And we've how we get past that and how we change that is something that I toy with quite a lot, because I go back to what I was saying before. I just feel like we're going over old ground again.
Yeah, you will get that. And I think that one of the things that has sparked me is that idea of having knowledge. And then my question is, whose knowledge? What knowledge are we actually talking about? What are we saying in terms of people being equipped to be able to really understand how we should be interacting with each other? Because there's histories written all over the place, but whose histories? And from what version? And from what level? Yeah. So I think that that the knowledge and the understanding is also tinged with a political objective.
But yeah, because even if we're looking in our own communities, I was having a conversation only the other day, and somebody was telling me about something about how Africa needs to I can't remember what the actual conversation was, but Africa needs to do something. I had to kind of break it down with them and saying, do you know how many countries there are within Africa? And to expect a whole nation or continent of people to think of things the same way, because we as England, Scotland and Wales can't even come to a coalition and agree with things. So how there's this expectation that we are all going to think the same, feel the same, understand things the same, just because we are a similar colouring, kind of baffles me. So it goes back to that knowledge element as well. But coming through, looking at that as an institutional way, how do we change that from it within the institutions? Can we change that element? How do we inform them? How do we share that knowledge, or how do we make sure that they gain that knowledge?
Kehinde?
Yeah. I think this is why there's two ways on this one. One is to what extent can you change the institution? And I'll be honest, I work in an institution, and I was talking to the students there actually about this. And the term that I usually use around what we're trying to do is not necessarily to decolonize the university, because the university is racism. Like, actually, where racism gets produced is the Western University. It's so deeply problematic that I'm not sure you can actually fix it. What we've essentially tried to do is colonize the institution. Like, we've got a space where it's different, we do different things, we kind of subverted what the university is. And there is a whole argument, really, that says maybe we need to have our own institutions, black institutions. And maybe black institutions is the way that you really can do different things, set different agendas, have different discussions and different conversations. Not that we'll have to agree with each other, but that we have to agree on some of the basics, I guess, like that we need something different, that we're anti-racist, etc., etc. But yeah, I have to say I'm very much in favor of black institutions. I don't know how we can expect to change these things, which have been what they've been for a long time, and produce the outcomes that they produce for a reason. Like, it's not an accident that this happens. It's kind of the point. So maybe we need to rely on other things and build different institutions if we really want freedom.
So you're looking more of a kind of an American shift to it then?
Not necessarily American, but you have Saturday schools is a perfect example, right? So you have a problem with the schools. Schools, we know they don't work. On the one hand, there's been lots of activism to try and make schools better, but on the other hand, we just said, well, we'll teach the kids ourselves, right? Because actually, you can't rely on schools. So in the UK, there's a long history of Saturday schools, bookshops, having our own legal advice centers, having our own housing association. There's like a really rich history of self-help in the UK. Because I think we've always realized that you just can't rely on those white institutions to do what we need to do.
Yeah, and I'd like to add to that in that, there has been this kind of rich tradition of self-help and mutual help support for not just for decades, but also for centuries. Like, if one looks at historical records, this has been going on because people probably cottoned on early that they needed to defend each other and they needed to work out ways to survive and make the best of what resources they had to hand. And I think sometimes this has been documented, sometimes it hasn't, but there are so many kind of models, historical models of this taking place. And, there was the reference to the education minister when Beryl Gilroy back in the 1950s was, promoting child-centered education. And she wasn't even, one of the first Caribbean teachers. She was one of the first notable black head teachers. But there was a whole wave of Caribbean teachers in the Caribbean who came to England as well and who were doing all of this stuff before. So there's always kind of history and precedence for a lot of the things we're talking about. And I think in some ways it's maybe about us bringing out more of what everyone's been doing in terms of how they identify themselves, having this sense more of, I guess, what people would nowadays call, reflecting our lived experience in ways that may have been hidden beforehand, or in ways in which we kind of secreted or, covertly kind of carried on our activities. It needs to be now more overt, and it needs to ideally be connected to each other through networks so that we can amplify it. Because, I certainly spent the whole of my childhood striving to do a certain amount of things in terms of gaining a really good education, going to university, doing all of these kind of things, which essentially were sort of entering institutions when actually, and it's not that I decry or think that was a waste of time, it was a really good opportunity, but at the same time I was hiding all these other cultural aspects of myself, or rather they weren't being recognized by people around me for decades kind of more until I found ways to kind of make them into parts of what are now a career. And I think there are many of us whereby we now need to be proud and happy about the things that we're doing, and we need to find ways to bring them to the surface and for them to become part of the ecosystem that we talk about. So we're not just talking about institutions, we're talking about all of us and all the many ways that we work and connect and do different things.
And that's a really interesting point that it brings me to, because we're talking about the institutions being racist, and I truly believe they are. But do you think that, I'm trying to frame this question properly, because in some ways, I know when I went to university, I wasn't prepared for it. And yes, the institution wasn't set out, and it wasn't for me. It wasn't prepared for me totally, which is what we're talking about here. But I know as a person coming from a working class area where I came from, a cultural background, I didn't even know how to talk to my lecturers. I didn't even know how to, they were using language that I wasn't used to hearing. So I used to have to take a dictaphone into my lectures and record it all, so I could come back and then decipher what was being said. And in some ways, I used to have to take a dictionary out to actually understand what these people were talking to me about. And just sitting with a lecturer to ask him how, am I doing okay? Is my subject matter okay? Was so daunting to me. And so, because I'd not really mixed with middle class people at that point in my life. I wasn't used to these people. I wasn't used to the way they spoke to me. I wasn't used to the way they interacted with me. It was a totally different experience. I went in and, I thought I was normal. And then I went into university and I realized that, okay, now these guys are all really different to me. So, do we need to kind of, is there something we need to be doing within our own communities, as well as expecting them to change the way they are? Is it a two-way thing?
I don't even think it's about us changing the way we are. I mean, one of the organisations I'm involved with is Phoenix Agenda, and the work that we're doing with young people is fundamentally about building, not just about building their self-esteem, but building social capital. Building that capital that says that we are networking with people within our community that have skills, that have businesses, and that they're interacting with our young people to show them the different opportunities that are available to them. That we're looking at the education system and we're saying, okay, what are the things that they need as a core, as a basis that will enable them to make the right choices, that they can make their own choices instead of having choices made for them. As a teacher, I get an uncomfortable feeling in my stomach anytime I hear people say, you have to change in order to get an education. Mm-hmm. The education system should enable me to be who I am and to be able to take on the bits of the things that I need in order for me to be the best version of myself. It shouldn't be the case that I have to deny myself in order to get ahead. And I feel quite strongly that what we're doing now is we're saying, unless you're prepared to become like the institution, the acceptable face of the institution, then we can't succeed. And I don't believe that that's the case, right? So, and the issue we have is that when you go to secondary school, when you go to university, the people who are judging you, the people who are creating the assessments, are doing it in order to maintain the status quo. I saw a reference to the exams regulator who put out a statement in one of the teaching magazines, and he said, we know that there are 7 different types of bias in terms of assessment. We want you to be aware of this as a teaching workforce. And that was it. They never said, this is how you should deal with it. This is what the challenges are. This is how we should overcome it. They accepted that there's 7 or more different types of bias that will affect us as Black people within this education system. They actually said it in 2020, I think they said it. And the reality of the situation is they're still giving these exams, they're still doing it the way they've always done it, and nobody is accountable for the bias that they do when they assess us. And still we're expected to achieve. Something has to change, and how it changes is by us giving our young people the skills to be able to maintain themselves within the system, but also to challenge if they need to, with the support from us as a community. And I just think that's the only way we can go.
Yeah, I mean, I just add to that is that actually the experiences you recount about going to uni and not feeling part of it, that is institutional racism.
Yeah, definitely.
Like a good example.
Yeah, definitely, 100%.
The way it's set up, and the way the hidden curriculum, the way you don't feel comfortable, that's the problem. Like, and so we have students at our uni where Black Studies, we get a lot of mature students, we get a lot of students who really wouldn't be students anywhere else, right? And we make an effort to say you're coming to the university. And by the end of the degree, they're doing high level work, right? Because it's a space where they feel comfortable, where they can come and talk to us, where it's a different environment, and we just made an effort. We don't talk in jargon. They're not dumb or anything like that. We just set up an institutional framework where they can succeed. Whereas if they went to like an elite university, they'd be gone within a day because they just wouldn't feel part of it. And that's the institution. And I guess the other part of that is, if you think about institutional racism broader, not just on the university level, then there definitely are differences. Like if you go to private school or grammar school, if you're middle class, your vocabulary is different, your experience of writing is different, and so you are actually coming into the university probably better equipped. That's also institutional racism.
Yes.
It's like, why is it, what's happening in the schools, why is it they're not getting the right literacy level, etc., etc. So yeah, it's all of that is about not saying that we have to do better, it's really about saying what's wrong with the system which is creating these things.
Absolutely.
What about you, Melanie? Have you got anything to say on that?
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think everything is skewed towards this thing of fitting in to this kind of monolithic, traditional edifice, which isn't, as I say, kind of fit for what we now know to be the 21st century, and a kind of a different type of plurality and a different type of thinking. So we hear the sort of chants of diversity, but we don't see it in practice. And I think also we have to bring in intersectionality into play, in that there'll be a lot of Black people, there'll be a lot of mixed race people, there'll be a lot of people who feel other because of intersectionality as well. And then obviously there's patriarchy, in that, patriarchy affects both men and women in terms of the way that it's been exacted over decades and centuries. So there are all these different, competing, jostling forces that one has to contend with. And I was someone where I was brought up rigidly Catholic. That's another huge institution. And then also I was exposed to the Opus Dei. But I was always kind of, growing up, I was incredibly submissive, obedient child who essentially, was kind of roped into many, many different institutions till I kind of, saw the error of my ways, and then have kind of moved towards this idea of how, of championing agency and the aspect of having voice, and I guess some of us have to go through these different journeys to kind of come through the other side. But I would rather that, people started out with the knowledge that they don't have to do that, and they had the option to be able to be the best of themselves. Particularly, as I say, I really want to emphasize this aspect of an ecosystem, because we talk about it, but we don't reflect it. We just reflect things around status. Whereas if we weren't always looking at status and whether people should fit in, or whether they're suitable enough to be part of this institution or that institution, we really would have a flourishing ecosystem where it wasn't just about kind of elitism. And then we wouldn't have all of these kind of issues around equity.
Okay, thank you for that. Thank you. So moving on to the next question that I have for you, well, I think we've already probably covered that, because what do you think still needs to change, and how would you implement that? I think probably we've addressed what needs to be changed, but what have we even addressed how to implement that? We've talked about needing our own schools and needing our own or needing our own kind of institutions to a certain extent. But will that ever happen? Realistically, if we could set up, well, I suppose it can happen, it does happen, we've got the schools here now, but in a ideal world, what would those institutions look like for them to be supportive to our communities?
Well, I think they have to be reflective of us, however we choose to define us, because institutions are run or governed or co-managed or co-developed by people.
Yeah, I kind of think, I'm thinking about what Kehinde said earlier, and I might be kind of contradicting myself here, but I just feel like that I don't think they can change. I think that and I'm answering my own question here, because the racism is so deep rooted, unless we knock the whole building down and start again, can they change?
Yes. The thing, though, is there are institutions that exist that aren't the sort of lauded institutions, but they are activist organisations. I would call them institutions because, to me, they are mighty. They're large in their significance. They might not be large in numbers, and they're making change. So to me, they fit the definitions of institutions. We just don't necessarily recognise them or cite them or reflect them. So for me, that there are all of these mighty forces in plain sight, and often they're becoming exhausted, or they're losing energy, or there isn't enough allegiance or allyship or solidarity for them actually to function.
Who would they be? Who would they be? Which ones would you say were doing?
Well, maybe someone else should speak. I've just spoken the last 2 times.
All right, you guys, come on.
I was going to say that I think that, who do I think should do it? I think that people are doing it. I think that there are examples of individuals, of groups and organisations who are striving to practice self-determination. They want to make the choices for themselves about how the work that they do should be articulated. And that is happening, and it's been happening all the time. The problem has been that it's always been in pockets. I've been kind of like really enthused by a couple of the initiatives that Kehinde has been involved in that, are really trying to say, something, we can be autonomous in our organisations as we have them, but there has to be a sort of a glue that links us together that will help us to manifest and to develop and to create that foundation that will keep us, will help us to grow stronger. And I think that it's things like that that will get us to change. I don't think you can kind of like have something that's quite monolithic that says this is what we should be doing as Black people, because that never works. We're all different, and the different regions, the different areas do different things.
But isn't that going back and saying that we're still the ones that need to change instead of it being those that need to change?
The reality of the situation, as far as I'm concerned, is that I am in a family of 4 generations living in this country. I did not think when I came into teaching 30 years ago that I would still be talking about the things that I am talking now. I did not think that my grandson would have to be having the same sorts of conversations, face the same challenges that his father faced 15 years ago. As far as I'm concerned, when I see that, right, then for me, the change has to come from me. It has to come from our community, because other communities will do it for themselves, right? And we have to do it for ourselves. That's just the reality of it. And I think that we go in waves. We have this embodiment of saying, like Black Lives Matter, different things. And we do it periodically, but it's about sustaining it now, as far as I'm concerned. It's just sustaining it. And, that's where I think we are.
Yeah, I agree. How do you...
I just add on to that is that I think that it's different to say that we need to change what we're doing in the institutions, but actually it's our responsibility to create something different. I mean, look, in an ideal world, it shouldn't be our responsibility, but that's the reality. where we have to do this. We don't really have a choice about it. We have done it historically as well. And so because of that, it's about learning from what's happened in the past. Don't think going to say we need to have black schools. Actually, most people, probably black people, will say this is a good idea, right?
Yes.
We have 50 years of supplementary schools, and we've seen what works. It's the black environment is really important. The nurturing way of the teachers, it's a different pedagogy you have in the school. The content of the curriculum, it just completely transforms and gets the students engaged. No, we've seen that work, right? So if we were going to say let's do a school, you do a school like that. The issue we've always had is the money of it, the finance of it. And really important thing about institutions is how can you make sure they're independent, where are we getting the money from? And this is partly about us putting the money in our hand in our own pocket, right? Like some of us have money, like we need to be much more willing to put that money in and invest that money into the community. I mean, there's actually one area where we should be trying to capitalize in the next few months, because the wave will die down and people will start talking about it. But there is actually quite a lot of opportunity to get some seed money, like fundamentally seed money, where we can start and then when we get that money, but get using to do things which is sustainable. So buy a building, don't run a project, because the project runs and finishes, don't actually get a building and you can run the project forever. So when we're thinking about how we get support and we get allyship from saying, well, actually, we need the things we can that are sustainable, that can keep it going forward. But certainly we've been doing this. It's just learning from the mistakes. And I think the biggest mistake we made as black people is we actually had more organisations 20 years ago than we have now.
Absolutely.
That's just a failing. We've got to admit that's a failing.
Absolutely.
And we need to be supporting those institutions and organisations so that that's not the case in the next 20 years.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah, definitely. I totally agree with that. I'll come back to that because something got my attention that you said earlier, but I will come back to that because I know you need to go quite soon. So
I do actually go in a couple of minutes.
Yeah. So just a final question, if you could answer first for us, is what do you think the next 5 years looks like?
It depends. I would say it depends. Look, if one of the things that's happened now, like with all the mobilizations and all and forget the institutions, but like one of the positive things about the last year has been young people out on the streets mobilizing, getting engaged back, getting organization. Us as a community talking about black organization. That's all positive. If we build on that momentum and start to really invest in institutions and organizations, and we started the Harambee organization of Black Unity for this reason, right? If we can build those things in 5 years, it will look very, 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 very good. But if we go back to, I guess, the pattern we probably fell into, which was trying to relying too much on these institutions which really don't work, then we're just going to be in similar problems. So it really depends. The next 5 years will depend on what we decide to do. Really.
Just a little kind of interlude into that, because you talk about us getting our own buildings and creating organisations for ourselves, which was something that happened 20 years ago. But what happens with a lot of it, once it gets to a certain, because they start off as non-for-profits, and then once the non-for-profits grow, they go into charities. And then once it becomes a charity, then we lose ownership. How do we come out of that? How do we change that?
I think that's why we're thinking about ownership, community ownership, independent. So what we try to do, with the model we're trying to do with the organisation, is actually get people to join a member organisation, pay money into the organisation. If you can get lots of people paying in, a bit like tax, right? Then that organisation is always sustainable. And I don't think we've really tried that before, right? Like if you look at other communities, they have no problem putting their hand in their pockets and putting it into the organisation.
Very true.
And if we're not willing to do that, we should just stop talking.
Absolutely.
That's no point, right? So,
absolutely.
And those are the kind of models we need to be going forward, I think.
Do you think that comes down to, because one of the things that we are really bad at is supporting each other as a community. It's how do we come out, and I do see that we do seem more joined up than we have been in a little while, and that we are communicating together as people, but are we moving forward enough in that? Because we do have to be supporting each other. The whole kind of small island thing that has got to finish. It's got to end. We need to come and realise that we have to come as one.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, one thing I do really to Robert. One thing I would just add on this is that actually, historically, if we actually look at a lot of the community organizations, it's very Caribbean and West Indies. And one of the things that's changed is, you've got young people who don't necessarily feel connected to the Caribbean. When African migrants come in, they don't feel connected. You've got mixed heritage, they don't feel connected. And I don't think we've actually really made that shift to a black identity, really, honestly.
Yeah, definitely.
I think that's a massive reason why things have fallen down, and we've kind of got moved. So how can we really rally around that collective identity, which can bring all of us in, is an important question.
That's a good one.
Yeah.
And to add to that, there's a really strong British Caribbean identity, which is separate to a Caribbean identity, which is distinctive through the whole experience and the kind of scarred experience of kind of living and growing up here, which we need to embrace but also learn from and ideally pull together, because there's a lot of models that were shown, decades ago that kind of solidarity helped people to get to better places, and pooling together seems to be one of the, unless you've got a trust fund, that seems to be the only way forward, really.
True.
Yeah. Not many of us got into it.
You can carry on.
Okay, thank you so much. Apologies for the technical difficulties and delay on getting you in, but thank you very much for giving us your time this evening. So, thank you. Okay, right. So, do you want to? Where are you in 5 years? Where do you think we're going to be in 5 years? What's
5 years? I think really
looking at where you're working and the people you're working with. Do you see a positive change in the next 5 years? I know you were saying there were small pockets, but is it something where the things that you're doing, you will see, you see there might be a change within the next 5 years, or from both perspectives? Yeah,
I think the work that I've been involved in with Phoenix Agenda has been something that we are an independent organisation. Our families pay into what we do, and we've been able to sustain that for nearly 2.5, nearly 3 years now. And we have a community around us, and we've also been able to make links with businesses and organisations who've also been supportive. So we're already kind of like doing that thing of extending our tentacles to actually build a network. One of the things that I feel really, really strongly about is that the young people that are coming up, they need to have a foundation. When they say it takes a village to raise a child, they really need that. And so therefore, I'm hoping that in the next 5 years, with the different organisations, with the Race Equality Centre, Phoenix Agenda, the African Heritage Alliance, with organisations that I've been involved with, that what we're doing is we're building that social capital for the young people that are coming up, to show them that there is a village around them that is there to support them, that will support them in the things that they have to do. And I think that as we grow as a network, that's what will eventually happen. So 5 years, that's what I want to see.
Good. And how about you, Melanie?
Yeah, I mean, I do tend to be a glass half full person, but I must say the last year and so has really tested my resilience and that of many people around me. So I think, the next 5 years, there seems to be a lot of rebuilding, but also I think there are opportunities in that, the last year has also shown how kind of going online and kind of using a lot of the kind of online tools and resources that have come through, how we can, how we as community groups or clusters or different groupings, however we choose to connect with each other, we can be quite resourceful in ways that used to be prohibitively expensive before. And there are ways that we can build businesses, build identities, kind of market things, sell things, So I want to sort of make the most of those things in partnership with the various kind of communities and artists that I'm working with, and I'm kind of optimistic about that. And as I say, what we're trying to do is we're trying to be more of who we are, to reflect our many different voices within a kind of sense of community, but also within a sense of really strong values and identity. And I think in order to do that, we have to learn more about each other and and all our different individual nuances, because we're all very different. You know, we come from different heritages and backgrounds, although many of us kind of share either Caribbean or African or mixed kind of ancestries. And I think part of being strong is getting to know each other, so that we can also kind of have statements where we kind of share our values, but we're also got our kind of strength within our individual voices. And I think that's kind of quite important for this time. The idea that we can all have our own voices and we can encourage a range of voices rather than the kind of dominant voice that used to be part of, you know, culture before. It was more about this idea of the kind of hero leader. Whereas I think, you know, in this new age, it's more about having a range of different voices, hopefully with some kind of common concern.
Yeah. Okay, right. Well, thank you very much for everybody that's been on the call today. I apologise again for the lateness and coming on, but I think we've had a really interesting conversation. I would like to take it further, but we'll pull it in there now. And just thank you for being part of today. Next week we'll be back on Thursday. We will be on time for 6:30. And we will be talking to Cecile Wright and Cephas Williams. So we will be looking at whether the society has changed enough to show that our young people will gain equality in the future. So stick with us. I hope you've enjoyed the discussion that we've had tonight, and we will be back with you next Thursday at 6:30. Thanks a lot. Bye.